Picture this, it's 1899, and little Emily Johnson can't stop coughing. Her worried mother in London doesn't reach for honey and lemon. Instead, she opens the family medicine cabinet and pulls out a bottle of Glyco-Heroin, manufactured by the trusted Bayer Pharmaceutical Company. The label promises it's perfectly safe for children, non-habit forming, and will cure that troublesome cough in no time. She carefully measures out a teaspoon of the sweet syrup and watches as Emily's cough subsides almost instantly. What Mrs. Johnson doesn't know is that she's just given her daughter one of the most addictive substances known to humanity, marketed as a children's cough remedy. This wasn't some back-alley quack medicine. This was cutting-edge pharmaceutical science, endorsed by doctors, advertised in respectable journals, and sold in every pharmacy from London to New York. The Victorians didn't just treat coughs with heroin. They celebrated it as one of medicine's greatest triumphs. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, if you're finding this fascinating, I'd love a like or subscribe. It really helps me bring you more stories like this. I'm always curious about our global community, so drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's continue this journey together. The story of how heroin became the Victorian era's go-to cough remedy begins not with evil drug dealers or careless doctors, but with genuine scientific progress and humanitarian intentions. In 1803, a young German pharmacist named Friedrich Serturner was working in a small apothecary in Westphalia when he made a discovery that would change medicine forever. He'd been experimenting with opium, that ancient pain reliever that humans had been using for thousands of years, trying to understand what made it work. After months of careful extraction and crystallization, he isolated a white crystalline alkaloid that was far more powerful than raw opium. He named it Morphine, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. Serturner tested his discovery the way many scientists of his era did, on himself and 3 young friends. They each took a substantial dose, and within minutes, they were experiencing effects unlike anything they'd felt before. The pain relief was extraordinary, but so were the other effects. As Serturner later wrote in his journal, they experienced the most delightful sensations followed by violent vomiting and a sleep so deep they could barely be roused. When they finally woke up, they were amazed to find that not only had their pain vanished, but even minor discomforts they hadn't noticed before were gone. One of his assistants, who'd been suffering from a persistent cough, noticed it had completely disappeared. This connection between opiates and cough suppression wasn't accidental. The Victorian medical establishment was beginning to understand that coughing and pain shared similar neural pathways. When morphine dampened the body's pain responses, it also suppressed the cough reflex. For a society plagued by tuberculosis, chronic bronchitis, and the consumption that killed more people than any other disease, this discovery seemed like a gift from heaven. The impact of respiratory diseases on Victorian society cannot be overstated. In Manchester's working-class districts, the air was so thick with coal smoke and industrial fumes that chronic coughs were simply part of life. Mill workers developed mill fever, their lungs clogged with cotton fibers. Miners suffered from black lung, their respiratory systems destroyed by coal dust. Even the wealthy weren't immune. The famous Victorian tendency to winter in warmer climates was often an attempt to escape the English cough that plagued them in London's fog. Dr. William Farr, the compiler of abstracts in the General Register Office, documented the scale of the problem in his 1847 report. The mortality from diseases of the respiratory organs exceeds that from any other class of diseases. In the metropolis alone, we lose annually above 20,000 persons from these afflictions, the majority preceded by distressing and prolonged coughing fits that destroy both patient and family peace. But morphine had its problems. Doctors quickly noticed that patients needed ever-increasing doses to achieve the same effects. By the 1850s, medical journals were filled with concerned articles about morphine hunger and the morphine habit. Dr. Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater, published in 1821, had already alerted. the public to the dark side of opiate use, though many dismissed his account as the ravings of a literary eccentric. The introduction of the hypodermic needle in the 1850s had made the morphine problem worse. Dr. Alexander Wood of Edinburgh, who pioneered the technique, initially believed that injecting morphine would prevent addiction because it bypassed the digestive system. He was tragically wrong. His own wife became one of the first recorded victims of injectable morphine addiction, dying from an overdose in 1894. Wood himself wrote in his later years, "I believed I had found a method of administration that would provide pain relief without the curse of habituation. Instead, I merely hastened the descent into dependence. The medical establishment was desperate for something better, a pain reliever and cough suppressant that had all of morphine's benefits without its addictive properties. They were about to get their wish, or so they thought." In 1874, in a modest laboratory at St. Mary's Hospital Medical School in London, a chemist named C.R. Alder Wright was experimenting with morphine, trying to create new compounds that might be useful to medicine. He combined morphine with acetic anhydride, creating a new substance called diacetylmorphine. Wright tested it on dogs and rabbits, noting that it caused great prostration, fear, and sleepiness. Finding these effects concerning rather than promising, he abandoned his research. His discovery might have remained a footnote in chemical history if not for events unfolding 20 years later in Germany. The Bayer Pharmaceutical Company, already famous for producing dyes and other chemicals, was expanding into medicines. They'd recently developed a new drug called aspirin and were looking for other breakthrough products. In 1895, a Bayer chemist named Felix Hoffmann, working under the supervision of Heinrich Dresser, independently synthesized diacetylmorphine. But unlike Wright, Dresser saw enormous potential in the compound. The Bayer laboratory in Elberfeld was a marvel of modern chemistry. Glass apparatus lined the benches, steam engines powered the mixing equipment, and white-coated chemists worked with an efficiency that would have been unimaginable just decades earlier. It was here that Dresser conducted his experiments, meticulously documenting every observation. His laboratory notebooks, preserved in the Bayer archives, reveal a systematic approach to testing the new compound. He tried different doses on rabbits, guinea pigs, and dogs, carefully noting their responses. Unlike Wright, who had been alarmed by the animals' reactions, Dresser interpreted the same effects differently. Where Wright saw prostration, Dresser saw therapeutic sedation. Where Wright noted fear, Dresser recorded initial adjustment period. The Bayer team began extensive testing, and the results seemed miraculous. The new drug was incredibly effective at suppressing coughs, even more so than codeine, which had become the standard treatment. Better yet, initial tests suggested it was less habit-forming than morphine. Patients reported feeling heroic, after taking it, leading to its trade name, heroin. Dresser's first human trials were conducted on Bayer employees suffering from coughs. The company had a tradition of testing new products on willing workers who received small bonuses for their participation. Fritz Müller, a dye worker who participated in these early trials, kept a diary that survived in his family's possession. His entry for November 12, 1897, reads, "Took the new medicine for my cough today. Most remarkable. Within minutes, the terrible hacking that has plagued me for weeks simply stopped. I felt warm and comfortable, as if wrapped in soft wool, worked my full shift without any discomfort. This is truly a wonder drug. The timing couldn't have been better for Bayer." The late Victorian era was experiencing what historians now call the tuberculosis pandemic. In cities like London, New York, and Berlin, as many as 1 in 4 deaths were caused by tuberculosis. The disease was called consumption because it seemed to consume people from within, causing them to waste away while coughing up blood. The persistent, violent coughing was not just a symptom. It was a source of intense suffering and social stigma. Consumptives were often isolated from society, not just because of contagion fears, but because their constant coughing made them unwelcome in public spaces. The social impact of tuberculosis shaped entire aspects of Victorian culture. The pale, thin, ethereal look that became fashionable among upper-class women, what they called consumptive chic, was actually mimicking the appearance of tuberculosis sufferers. The romantic movement's fascination with tragic, beautiful death was largely inspired by consumption, which seemed to afflict artistic, sensitive souls. Poets like John Keats, who died of tuberculosis at 25, became symbols of this aesthetic. But for every romanticized death, there were thousands of ordinary people suffering in tenements and workhouses, their coughs a constant reminder of mortality. Dr. James Morrison, a prominent London physician, wrote in his 1898 diary about visiting a tuberculosis patient. The poor woman had been coughing so violently and continuously that she had broken 2 ribs. Her family was at wit's end, unable to sleep for weeks due to her nocturnal fits. When I administered the new heroin preparation from Bayer, the transformation was remarkable. Within 20 minutes, her cough had subsided entirely. She wept with relief, as did her exhausted husband. I left that house feeling I had witnessed a medical miracle. Morrison's detailed case notes, discovered in the archives of the Royal College of Physicians, provide a window into medical practice of the era. He prescribed heroin liberally, for tuberculosis certainly, but also for bronchitis, asthma, hay fever, and even nervous coughs. One of his patients, a Mrs. Adelaide Thornton, received heroin for what Morrison described as a hysteric cough, likely what we would now recognize as anxiety-induced. His notes from March 1899 state, Mrs. T's cough, which no other remedy could touch, yields completely to heroin. She reports sleeping through the night for the first time in months, have increased her dose as the effect seems to diminish over time. Bayer launched heroin in 1898 with one of the most sophisticated marketing campaigns the pharmaceutical industry had ever seen. They sent free samples to physicians across Europe and America. They placed advertisements in medical journals with bold claims: heroin, the sedative for coughs, non-habit forming, suitable for children. They produced heroin in every conceivable form: tablets, elixirs, lozenges, and even water-soluble salts for injection. The marketing materials themselves were works of art. One advertisement, preserved in the Museum of the History of Medicine in Vienna, shows a classical Greek figure holding aloft a bottle of heroin while tuberculosis sufferers reach up toward it in supplication. The religious imagery was intentional. Heroin was presented as salvation from suffering. Another ad featured a grandmother giving heroin syrup to a grandchild, with the tagline, "3 generations trust Bayer's heroin." Bayer's sales representatives, known as detail men, were trained not just in the product's features, but in sophisticated sales psychology. Their training manual, a copy of which exists in the Bayer archives, instructs them to emphasize the scientific nature of heroin's discovery and to contrast it with old-fashioned remedies based on folklore rather than chemistry. They were told to leave samples liberally and to follow up with doctors who showed interest. One particularly successful representative, Hans Zimmermann, reportedly converted entire medical districts to heroin use through his persistent and charming approach. The medical establishment embraced heroin with enthusiasm that seems shocking in hindsight. The Boston Medical and Surgical Journal declared it a remedy of extraordinary value. The Lancet published glowing reports of its effectiveness. At the 1899 Congress of German Naturalists and Physicians, heroin was hailed as a breakthrough on par with the discovery of vaccination. Dr. Maximilian von Pettenkofer, the renowned hygienist and public health pioneer, gave a speech at the Congress that was reprinted in medical journals across Europe. "We stand at the threshold of a new era in respiratory medicine. Heroin represents the culmination of scientific progress, a substance that provides relief without habituation, that soothes without sedating excessively, that can be given to the youngest child or the most elderly patient with equal safety. Bayer has given us a tool that will save countless lives." But it wasn't just doctors who were impressed. The public fell in love with heroin. Finally, here was something that actually worked for those terrible coughs that plagued Victorian society. And unlike morphine, which carried the stigma of the opium den, and the addict's needle, heroin was respectable. It came from Bayer, the same company that made aspirin. It was endorsed by physicians. It was science. Sarah Hammond, a middle-class housewife in Manchester, kept a detailed diary that provides a window into everyday heroin use. In January 1901, she wrote, "Little James has been coughing terribly all week. The doctor prescribed Glyco-Heroin from Bayer. What a blessing! 1 teaspoon, and he sleeps peacefully through the night. I've started taking it myself for my bronchitis. It gives such a pleasant feeling of warmth and well-being. Mother says it's helped her rheumatism as well. We always keep a bottle in the house now." By March, her entries had changed. "Find myself looking forward to my evening dose of heroin, perhaps more than I should. The warmth and comfort it provides have become quite necessary for sleep. James seems fretful when we forget his dose, even though his cough cleared weeks ago. Mother takes it several times daily now. She says for various ailments, though she seems quite well." The pharmaceutical industry quickly realized they'd struck gold. By 1902, heroin-based medications were being produced by dozens of companies. There was Glyco-Heroin for general coughs, heroin hydrochloride for injection, and specialized formulations for children. One popular brand, Dr. James's soothing syrup, contained heroin along with alcohol and chloroform, creating what one modern pharmacologist called a cocktail of unconsciousness. The variety of heroin products was staggering. There were heroin throat lozenges flavored with honey and lemon. Heroin wine tonics promised to fortify the constitution while soothing respiratory distress. Heroin cigarettes, yes, cigarettes, were marketed for asthma sufferers. The idea being that inhaling heroin smoke would deliver the medicine directly to the lungs. One company even produced heroin suppositories for infants too young to take oral medications. The marketing of these products was remarkable in its brazenness. Advertisements showed cherubic children sleeping peacefully after their dose of heroin cough syrup. One particularly memorable ad from 1903 featured a concerned mother holding a bottle of heroin elixir with the tagline, "When baby can." Sleep and coughs disturb the household. Trust Bayer's heroin, the scientific solution for nighttime peace. Women's magazines of the era regularly featured articles extolling heroin's virtues. The Modern Mother's Medicine Cabinet, published in Ladies' Home Journal in 1904, listed heroin preparations as essential household items alongside carbolic soap and witch hazel. The article, written by a trained nurse, assured readers that heroin is as safe as it is effective, suitable for the most delicate constitution. Pharmacists couldn't keep heroin products in stock. John Pemberton, a drugstore owner in Atlanta, who had earlier invented Coca-Cola, which originally contained cocaine, wrote to his supplier in 1904, "Please rush another gross of heroin tablets and 2 cases of the elixir. Demand exceeds anything I've seen in 20 years of pharmacy. Every family wants it for their medicine chest." The records of the Eberhard and Sons pharmaceutical distributors in Philadelphia show the explosive growth in heroin sales. In 1898, they shipped 50 pounds of heroin products. By 1900, it was 500 pounds. By 1905, they were moving over 2,000 pounds annually. Their sales ledgers, preserved in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, list hundreds of pharmacies ordering heroin products by the case. The international spread of heroin was rapid and remarkable. By 1905, it was being manufactured not just in Germany, but in the United States, Britain, France, and Japan. Each country developed its own formulations and brands. In America, the Eli Lilly Company produced a particularly popular version. In Britain, Burroughs Wellcome and Company created tablet forms that became standard in military medical kits. The French had their own approach to heroin marketing. Pharmacie Centrale de France produced Sirop Benoit, a heroin cough syrup that became so popular it was mentioned in Marcel Proust's writings. French doctors seemed particularly enthusiastic about injectable heroin, using it not just for coughs but for all manner of respiratory complaints. Dr. Georges Clemenceau, before he became prime minister, was a physician who regularly prescribed heroin, writing in a medical journal, "This German discovery may be their greatest gift to civilization." In Russia, heroin took on an almost mystical quality. The Tsarist court physician, Dr. Eugene Botkin, who would later die with the Romanov family, introduced heroin treatments for the Tsarevich Alexei's coughing fits. The hemophiliac heir to the throne couldn't risk the violent coughing that might trigger bleeding, so heroin seemed like a godsend. Court records show regular orders for Heroinsky from German suppliers. Japan's engagement with heroin was particularly interesting. The Meiji government, eager to modernize and adopt Western medicine, embraced heroin enthusiastically. Japanese pharmaceutical companies quickly learned to manufacture their own versions. By 1910, Japan was not only self-sufficient in heroin production, but was exporting it to China and Korea. The Japanese Military Medical Corps adopted heroin as standard treatment for respiratory ailments among soldiers. The economics of heroin were staggering. Bayer's profits from heroin sales exceeded those from aspirin in the early years. The global trade in opium, which provided the raw material for heroin production, became one of the most valuable commodity markets in the world. The British Empire's control of Indian opium production gave it a significant advantage in the pharmaceutical trade. The opium supply chain that fed heroin production was a marvel of colonial exploitation. Indian farmers were forced to grow opium poppies instead of food crops, creating famines that killed millions. The raw opium was processed in factories in Calcutta and Bombay, then shipped to pharmaceutical companies in Europe and America. The same imperial system that had forced opium on China in the Opium Wars now supplied the raw material for respectable medicine in London drawing rooms. Stock market records from the era show pharmaceutical company shares soaring. Bayer's stock price tripled between 1898 and 1905. Investors rushed to fund new pharmaceutical ventures. The St. Louis Stock Exchange recorded frenzied trading in shares of Mallinckrodt Chemical Works after they announced plans to manufacture heroin. One broker's diary noted, "The heroin boom exceeds even the railroad mania of previous decades. Every druggist wants to become a manufacturer." But even as heroin conquered the medicine cabinets of the world, disturbing reports were beginning to emerge. Dr. Oscar Jennings in Philadelphia noted in 1902 that several of his patients who had been taking heroin for chronic coughs were now unable to stop. They claimed to need it not for the cough, which has long since resolved, but for the prevention of certain distressing symptoms that occur when they attempt to discontinue use, he wrote. These early warnings were largely ignored or explained away. The medical establishment had too much invested in heroin's success. When patients developed what doctors called heroin habits, it was attributed to their weak moral character rather than the drug itself. The concept of physical addiction was poorly understood. Many doctors believed that only certain types of people, the working class, immigrants, those of nervous disposition, were susceptible to drug habits. Dr. George Petty, one of the first physicians to recognize heroin addiction as a medical rather than moral problem, wrote in his 1903 book, The Narcotic Drug Diseases and Allied Ailments. The medical profession has been strangely slow to recognize that heroin, far from being the non-addictive substitute for morphine we were promised, is actually more enslaving than its predecessor. I have seen patients who never touched liquor, who attend church regularly, who are pillars of their communities, reduced to abject dependence on this drug. The class dynamics of heroin use were particularly striking. While opium dens were associated with the urban poor and Chinese immigrants, heroin was thoroughly middle class. It was expensive, sold in respectable pharmacies, and prescribed by family doctors. Taking heroin for a cough was as socially acceptable as taking aspirin for a headache. This respectability made the growing addiction crisis harder to recognize. When Mrs. Margaret Ashworth, wife of a prominent Birmingham industrialist, began taking heroin for a persistent cough in 1903, no one thought twice about it. By 1905, she was consuming enormous quantities daily. Her family doctor, writing in a private letter, noted, "Mrs. A continues to require her heroin preparation in ever-increasing amounts. She becomes quite hysterical if unable to obtain it. Yet she maintains this is purely for her bronchial condition, which resolved many months ago. I am at a loss to explain this phenomenon. The Ashworth family's personal papers donated to the Birmingham City Archives reveal the full tragedy. Margaret's husband, Charles, initially supportive of her medicine use, gradually became alarmed. His business diary from 1906 contains increasingly worried entries. M spent £15 at the chemist this month, more than our servants' wages. Found M had been visiting 3 different pharmacies to obtain her medicine. Dr. Harrison refuses to prescribe more, says M. Must be weaned off. She flew into such a rage I feared for the servants. The children's market for heroin was particularly troubling in retrospect. Victorian parents, terrified of childhood diseases and desperate to soothe crying babies, turned to heroin-based products with alarming frequency. Mother's Friend, Infant's Quietness, and Children's Comfort were just a few of the brands that contained significant amounts of heroin. The ingredient lists of these children's medications, when they existed at all, were masterpieces of obfuscation. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup listed its contents as morphia sulfate, aqua ammonia, alcohol, and harmless vegetable extracts. Nowhere did it mention that morphia sulfate was essentially heroin. Parents who would have been horrified at the thought of giving their children opium unknowingly dosed them with something even more potent. Dr. Helen McMurtry, one of the few female physicians of the era, began documenting cases of what she called soothing syrup babies, infants who showed signs of drug dependence. In her 1906 report to the Toronto Board of Health, she wrote, "These children display a peculiar lethargy interrupted by periods of extreme irritability. They fail to thrive, showing poor weight gain and delayed development. Most disturbing is their absolute dependence on their daily dose of medicine, without which they become inconsolable." McMurtry's files, preserved in the Toronto archives, contain heartbreaking case studies. Baby William R., aged 6 months, was brought to her clinic by his distraught mother. The child had been given Infant's Friend since he was 2 weeks old for colic. When the mother tried to stop the medicine, the baby screamed continuously, refused to eat, and developed tremors. It took weeks of gradual weaning to free the infant from dependence. The tuberculosis sanatoriums, where heroin use was most concentrated, became inadvertent laboratories for observing drug dependence. Dr. Ernst van Houten, working at a Swiss sanatorium, documented the progression in his patients. They arrive seeking relief from their cough. Heroin provides this admirably, but within weeks, they require it not for the cough, but for its own sake. They describe feelings of unease, restlessness, and profound discomfort when the drug is withdrawn. Many become more concerned with obtaining their heroin than with treating their underlying disease. The Davos Sanatorium, made famous by Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, was a particular hotbed of heroin use. Wealthy tubercular patients from across Europe gathered there, and heroin flowed freely. One patient, an English aristocrat named Lady Constance Bradley, wrote extensive letters to her sister describing life in the sanatorium. Initially enthusiastic about her heroin treatment, her tone gradually changed. By 1907, she was writing, "The cure has become worse than the disease. We are all slaves to our little bottles. The doctors assure us this is temporary, but I see patients who have been here for years, still dependent on their doses." Sanatorium records show the escalating doses required by long-term patients. What started as 5 milligrams 3 times daily often escalated to 50 or even 100 milligrams per day within months. The staff, initially unconcerned, began to notice that patients would fake coughs to obtain more heroin. Some hoarded their supplies, others traded different formulations, creating a primitive drug economy within the institution. World War I marked a turning point in the heroin story. Military medical corps on all sides used heroin extensively, not just for coughs, but for battlefield injuries. Thousands of soldiers returned home with what was euphemistically called the soldier's disease, addiction to medical opiates. Captain William Hartley of the British Medical Corps wrote in his memoirs, "We dispensed heroin tablets like candy, for gas-damaged lungs, for shell shock, for wounds, for simple exhaustion. It was our universal answer to suffering. Only later did we realize we had created an army of addicts. The scale of military heroin use was staggering. The British Army Medical Corps supply records show they ordered 5 tons of heroin products in 1916 alone. Field hospitals were supplied with tabloid-brand heroin tablets that could be dissolved in water or taken directly. Medics carried heroin in their kit bags alongside bandages and morphine. The standing orders were to use heroin liberally for any respiratory distress, which in the gas-filled trenches of the Western Front meant almost constantly. Lieutenant Charles Morrison of the Canadian Expeditionary Force kept a detailed diary of his medical treatment after being gassed at Passchendaele. "The doctor gives me heroin tablets 6 times daily for my burned lungs. They provide blessed relief from the constant feeling of drowning. Some of the lads have been on them for months." Private Jenkins jokes that he'll open a pharmacy when he gets home. He knows so much about doses and timing. The war also disrupted international supply chains, leading to shortages and a black market. For the first time, heroin moved from the pharmacy to the street. Demobilized soldiers who couldn't obtain medical supplies turned to illegal sources. The respectable medicine was becoming something else entirely. In the port cities where soldiers embarked and disembarked, a thriving underground trade developed. Police records from Liverpool show arrests for illegal trafficking in medical supplies increasing tenfold between 1914 and 1918. Most of those arrested were former military medical personnel who had stolen supplies, or soldiers who had hoarded their prescriptions. The transformation of heroin from medicine to contraband had begun. The social impact extended beyond the soldiers themselves. Wives and families, dealing with traumatized veterans, often turned to heroin themselves. Mrs. Dorothy Patterson, whose husband returned from the Somme with severe shell shock, wrote in her diary, "Robert's night terrors keep the entire household awake. I've begun taking his heroin tablets myself, just to sleep, just to cope. I tell myself it's temporary, but I notice I need them even on his calmer nights." By 1910, the medical establishment could no longer ignore the evidence. The same journals that had praised heroin were now publishing alarmed editorials about the heroin evil. Dr. Charles Towns, who ran an addiction treatment clinic in New York, testified before Congress in 1913, "Heroin is the most dangerous drug we have ever encountered. It creates addiction faster than any other substance." The claim that it is non-habit forming is not merely wrong, it is the opposite of truth. Towns's clinic records, preserved in the New York Academy of Medicine, provide a window into the growing crisis. His patient files from 1910 to 1915 show a dramatic shift from treating alcohol and morphine addiction to predominantly heroin cases. The social profile of his patients was telling. Middle-class housewives, professional men, respectable elderly people who had started with prescriptions for coughs or pain. One case file details the treatment of Mrs. Eleanor Vanderbilt, name changed in the original, a 45-year-old society matron who had been taking heroin for chronic bronchitis since 1905. By 1912, she was consuming 200 milligrams daily, spending her entire household allowance on the drug. Her withdrawal, documented in excruciating detail, lasted 3 weeks and included hallucinations, violent tremors, and suicidal thoughts. Towns noted, patient required constant supervision and restraint. The severity of heroin withdrawal exceeds anything I have observed with morphine or alcohol. The statistics were becoming impossible to ignore. In New York City alone, admissions to Bellevue Hospital for heroin addiction had increased from virtually 0 in 1900 to over 450 in 1915. Similar patterns were seen in every major city. What's more, these were mostly middle-class patients who had started using heroin for legitimate medical reasons. Dr. Alexander Lambert's research at Cornell University Medical College provided scientific backing for what clinicians were observing. His studies showed that heroin was not only more addictive than morphine, but that it created dependence faster and more completely. His 1913 paper, The Obliteration of the Craving for Narcotics, documented the biochemical changes in heroin addicts and proposed treatment protocols that would influence addiction medicine for decades. Mary Sullivan's case was typical. A 34-year-old teacher from Boston, she began taking heroin for bronchitis in 1908. By 1912, she was consuming massive quantities daily. In a letter to her sister, she wrote, "I am enslaved by this medicine. I wake thinking of it and sleep only when I have had enough. My salary goes entirely to the pharmacy. I have pawned grandmother's jewelry. I know this is killing me, yet I cannot stop. The agony when I try is beyond description." Sullivan's complete correspondence, donated to the Boston Public Library, chronicles her descent into addiction with heartbreaking clarity. Her early letters praise heroin's effectiveness. By 1910, she's mentioning needing a bit more than prescribed to achieve the same relief. By 1911, she's visiting multiple pharmacies, lying to doctors, and spending every cent on heroin. Her final letters, written from the Massachusetts State Hospital where she was committed for treatment, describe withdrawal symptoms in vivid detail. "My bones feel as if they're breaking. My skin crawls with invisible insects. I would sell my soul for one dose." The pharmaceutical industry fought back against growing criticism. Bayer insisted that heroin was safe when used as directed. They blamed addiction on patient misuse and overprescription by careless doctors. Internal company documents, discovered decades later, reveal they knew about addiction potential as early as 1902, but continued marketing heroin as non-addictive. A particularly damning memo from Heinrich Dresser to Bayer's board of directors, dated March 1903, states, "Reports of habituation to heroin are increasing. We must consider our response carefully. The product remains highly profitable, and many patients use it without incident. Perhaps we should modify our advertising to emphasize proper medical supervision rather than withdraw the product entirely." The board chose to continue sales with minor labeling changes. Bayer's competitors were equally culpable. Merck, Eli Lilly, and dozens of smaller companies continued to produce and market heroin products, even as evidence of addiction mounted. The Pharmaceutical Era, a trade journal, published articles with titles like "Defending Heroin Against Unfair Attacks" and "The Heroin Habit, a Problem of Weak Character, Not Chemistry." Reform movements began organizing. The Society for the Suppression of the Opium Trade, originally focused on the Anglo-Chinese opium trade, expanded its mission to include domestic pharmaceutical opiates. Women's groups, particularly the Women's Christian Temperance Union, made heroin restriction a key cause. They organized boycotts of pharmacies that sold heroin products and lobbied for legislative control. The WCTU's campaign was particularly effective because it mobilized middle-class women who had personal experience with heroin addiction in their families. Mrs. Sarah Thornton, president of the Chicago chapter, gave speeches describing her daughter's addiction to heroin cough syrup. "This is not a problem of the slums or the foreign quarters," she declared. "This poison is in our own medicine cabinets, given to our own children, prescribed by our own trusted doctors." The medical profession itself was split. Older doctors who had built practices on prescribing heroin resisted change. Younger physicians, influenced by new understandings of addiction, pushed for restrictions. Medical conferences became battlegrounds between the two factions. Dr. Alexander Lambert, Theodore Roosevelt's personal physician, emerged as a leading voice for control, arguing that heroin has no place in medical practice except under the strictest supervision. The 1912 International Medical Congress in London featured heated debates about heroin. Dr. Wilhelm Epstein of Germany defended its use, citing thousands of successful treatments. Dr. Hamilton Wright of the United States countered with statistics on addiction. The conference ended without consensus, but the very fact that heroin's safety was being debated marked a shift in medical opinion. Professional medical journals began refusing heroin advertisements. The Journal of the American Medical Association, which had carried full-page Bayer ads, announced in 1913 that it would no longer accept advertising for heroin products. This decision cost the journal significant revenue, but marked an important ethical stance. Other journals followed suit, though some continued to carry ads well into the 1920s. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 marked the beginning of the end for legal heroin in America. The act required registration of all narcotic sales and imposed taxes designed to limit distribution. While not banning heroin outright, it made it increasingly difficult for doctors to prescribe and pharmacists to dispense. The passage of the Harrison Act was itself a drama of competing interests. Pharmaceutical companies lobbied heavily against it, arguing it would interfere with legitimate medical practice. Reform groups countered with parades of addiction victims and their families. Congressional hearings featured testimony from doctors, pharmacists, addicts, and law enforcement. Representative Francis Burton Harrison, the act's sponsor, declared, "We must choose between the profits of a few companies and the welfare of our citizens. The choice is clear." The international community was also mobilizing. The International Opium Convention of 1912, signed at The Hague, committed nations to controlling heroin trade. World War I delayed implementation, but by 1920, most Western nations had imposed strict controls. Bayer finally ceased heroin production in 1913, though other companies continued for several more years. The human cost of the heroin epidemic was staggering. By 1920, an estimated 200,000 Americans were addicted to heroin, most having started with legitimate medical use. In Britain, the numbers were proportionally similar. Families were destroyed, careers ruined, and lives lost. The respectable medicine had become a social scourge. Government reports from the era paint a grim picture. The Treasury Department's Special Narcotic Committee documented thousands of cases of middle-class addiction. Their 1919 report included testimonials from addicts, family members, and treatment providers. One section, titled From Medicine Cabinet to Morgue, traced the typical progression from prescription to addiction to death. Treatment options were limited and often brutal. Cold turkey withdrawal was the standard approach, with patients locked in hospital wards to endure days of agony. Cures ranged from the useless to the dangerous. Some doctors prescribed cocaine to treat heroin addiction, creating dual dependencies. Others used methods like hydrotherapy, electrical shock, and purgatives that did more harm than good. The town's Lambert treatment, considered state-of-the-art, involved a combination of belladonna, xanthoxylum, and hyoscyamus, along with vigorous catharsis. Patients were purged repeatedly while hallucinating from the belladonna. The treatment was so harsh that some patients died from dehydration and exhaustion. Yet it was considered preferable to the slower death of continued addiction. Private sanatoriums sprang up promising discreet treatment for addiction. These facilities, often located in rural areas, charged enormous fees to wealthy families desperate to hide their shame. The Keeley Institute, originally founded to treat alcoholism, expanded to treat heroin addiction using its gold cure, injections of double chloride of gold, which had no actual therapeutic value but provided a placebo effect for desperate patients. The heroin story didn't end with legal prohibition. The illegal trade that emerged in the 1920s traced its origins directly to the medical heroin epidemic. Criminal organizations stepped in to supply former medical users. The transformation of heroin from medicine to street drug was complete, but the demand created by Victorian doctors persisted for generations. Police records from the 1922 show how quickly the illegal trade organized. In New York, the Jewish and Italian gangs that would later dominate organized crime cut their teeth on heroin distribution. Arnold Rothstein, the infamous gambler and criminal mastermind, was one of the first to recognize the potential profits in supplying former medical addicts. His network imported heroin from Europe, where it was still legally manufactured, and distributed it through a network of corrupt doctors and pharmacists. The language around heroin changed dramatically. What had been medicine became dope. Users went from patients to junkies. The social stigma that had been absent when heroin was legal and medical descended with full force once it became illegal. Middle-class addicts found themselves associating with criminals, visiting dangerous neighborhoods, and risking arrest to obtain their drugs. Looking back at newspaper archives from the period, the contrast is striking. A 1900 advertisement in the Times shows a smiling child with the caption "Heroin," the perfect children's cough remedy. By 1920, the same newspaper was running exposés on dope fiends and the heroin menace. The speed of this transformation, from wonder drug to social evil in just 2 decades, remains one of the most dramatic reversals in medical history. The cultural impact of the heroin epidemic extended far beyond medicine. It influenced literature, art, and social policy for generations. Writers like William S. Burroughs, whose own addiction began with medical opiates, traced a direct line from Victorian medicine cabinets to 20th century counterculture. The image of the addict, first formed during the heroin epidemic, shaped drug policy and social attitudes that persist today. Personal accounts from survivors provide the most poignant testimony. Eleanor Whitman, who became addicted to heroin cough syrup in 1907, lived to tell her story in the 1960s. In an interview, she recalled, "We had no idea what we were taking. The doctor said it was safe. The pharmacist recommended it. Everyone used it. By the time we understood what was happening, it was too late for so many of us. I lost my husband, my sister, and nearly my own life to that safe cough medicine." Whitman's full interview, preserved in the Columbia University Oral History Archives, provides extraordinary detail about life as a middle-class addict in the 1910s. She describes the subterfuges necessary to maintain her supply, the doctor shopping, the fake symptoms, the hidden bottles. She talks about the shame of a respectable woman reduced to lying and stealing for medicine. Most powerfully, she describes the physical and psychological torment of addiction. "It wasn't just that I needed it for the cough anymore. I needed it to feel normal, to get through the day, to be the person everyone expected me to be." The scientific understanding of why heroin was so addictive came too late to prevent the crisis. Researchers eventually discovered that heroin crosses the blood-brain barrier more efficiently than morphine, converting back to morphine once inside the brain, but delivering a more intense effect. The acetyl groups that Bayer's chemists had added didn't make the drug less addictive. They made it more potent and faster acting. Dr. Ernst Spengler's groundbreaking research in the 1920s finally explained the mechanism of heroin addiction. Using new techniques in brain chemistry, he demonstrated that heroin caused fundamental changes in neural receptors, creating physical dependence at the cellular level. His work, published in German scientific journals, provided the theoretical framework for understanding addiction as a medical condition rather than a moral failing. Unfortunately, this understanding came too late for the hundreds of thousands already addicted. The regulatory response to the heroin crisis shaped drug policy for the next century. The strict controls imposed on opiates created the framework for modern drug regulation. The Pure Food and Drug Act, the creation of the FDA, and the entire system of prescription controls can trace their origins to the heroin epidemic. In trying to prevent another heroin crisis, regulators created systems that still govern medicine today. The evolution of drug regulation in response to the heroin crisis was remarkable in its scope. Before heroin, anyone could walk into a pharmacy and purchase virtually any drug without restriction. The concept of prescription-only medicines didn't exist. The Harrison Act introduced the revolutionary idea that certain drugs were too dangerous for unrestricted sale. This principle, born from the heroin disaster, became the foundation of modern pharmaceutical regulation. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on public trust in medical authority. The heroin crisis was one of the first times that the medical establishment had been so spectacularly, publicly wrong about something so important. Doctors who had prescribed heroin with complete confidence faced the consequences of their certainty. The blind faith in medical progress that characterized the Victorian era gave way to a more skeptical, questioning attitude that persists today. Medical education changed in response to the crisis. Schools began teaching about addiction, drug interactions, and the importance of long-term observation. The concept of first, do no harm took on new meaning when doctors realized they had been inadvertently harming thousands of patients. Young doctors in the 1920s were taught the heroin story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of enthusiasm for new treatments. The parallels to our current opioid crisis are impossible to ignore. Once again, pharmaceutical companies marketed opioids as safe and non-addictive. Once again, Doctors prescribed them widely for pain and other conditions. Once again, addiction followed, devastating communities and families. The OxyContin story of the 1990s and 2000s reads like a repeat of the heroin story of the 1890s and 1900s, with remarkably similar corporate strategies, medical enthusiasm, and eventual recognition of disaster. The Purdue Pharma marketing of OxyContin bears an eerie resemblance to Bayer's heroin campaign. The emphasis on scientific advancement, the minimization of addiction risk, the targeting of respectable patients. All these tactics were pioneered a century earlier. Even the language is similar. Where Bayer promised heroin was non-habit forming, Purdue claimed OxyContin had less than 1% addiction risk when used as directed. What makes the Victorian heroin epidemic particularly instructive is how it demonstrates the dangerous combination of scientific progress, commercial interest, and medical authority. Each element alone might have been manageable, but together they created a perfect storm. Scientific discovery provided the substance, commercial interest ensured its wide distribution, and medical authority convinced people it was safe. The role of advertising in the heroin epidemic deserves special attention. Victorian pharmaceutical advertising was unregulated and often wildly misleading. Companies made claims that would be illegal today, promising cures for everything from cancer to character flaws. The heroin advertisements, with their images of happy children and peaceful elderly people, created a powerful narrative that overcame natural caution about drug use. The Victorian era's approach to cough treatment reveals deeper truths about how societies respond to suffering. The desperate desire to alleviate the misery of tuberculosis and other respiratory diseases was entirely understandable. Parents watching their children cough themselves to exhaustion, doctors unable to offer relief, a society where 1 in 4 died of consumption. In this context, heroin seemed like a miracle. That it turned out to be a poison disguised as medicine makes the story tragic rather than villainous. The gender dynamics of the heroin epidemic were particularly complex. Women, as the primary caregivers in Victorian households, were both the main purchasers and users of heroin products. They bought it for their children, their elderly parents, and themselves. The image of the respectable Victorian matron, secretly dependent on her medicine, became a cultural archetype that influenced perceptions of female addiction for generations. Women's journals from the era reveal how deeply heroin became embedded in domestic life. Recipe books included instructions for homemade cough remedies featuring heroin. Household management guides listed it among essential supplies. Letters between sisters and friends recommended specific brands and doses. The drug became part of the female sphere of household management and caregiving, making its dangers even more insidious. The pharmaceutical industry's role deserves particular scrutiny. Bayer's marketing of heroin as non-addictive, when evidence suggested otherwise, established a pattern that would repeat throughout the 20th century. The tension between profit and public health, between innovation and safety, between marketing claims and medical reality. All these conflicts that define modern pharmaceutical regulation have their roots in the heroin story. Internal pharmaceutical company documents from the era, many only discovered decades later, reveal the extent of corporate knowledge about addiction risks. A 1905 letter from a Bayer sales representative to headquarters notes, "Doctors in my territory report increasing numbers of patients who cannot discontinue heroin use. How should I address their concerns?" The response, marked confidential, advises emphasizing proper dosing and suggesting that problem cases represent individual susceptibility rather than product deficiency. The medical profession's failure is equally instructive. The enthusiasm with which doctors embraced heroin, their dismissal of early warnings, their attribution of addiction to moral weakness rather than pharmaceutical action. These errors reveal the dangers of medical certainty. The heroin crisis was one of the first major instances of iatrogenic, doctor-caused mass addiction. But it wouldn't be the last. Medical journals from 1900 to 1910 show the profession's gradual awakening to the crisis they had created. Early articles defending heroin gave way to concerned case reports, then to alarmed editorials calling for restriction. The process took a full decade, during which thousands more became addicted. The slow pace of medical recognition of harm would be repeated with many drugs throughout the 20th century. For individual families, the heroin epidemic was intensely personal. Reading through family letters and diaries from the period, one finds story after story of gradual recognition and growing horror. The medicine that had seemed like such a blessing slowly revealed itself as a curse. Parents who had given heroin to their children lived with guilt that lasted lifetimes. Spouses watched their partners transform from patients to addicts, unsure where healing ended and harm began. The Carrington family papers, held at the Massachusetts Historical Society, provide a particularly complete record of one family's experience. George Carrington, a successful merchant, began taking heroin for chronic bronchitis in 1902. His wife Mary's diary traces his descent into addiction with painful clarity. By 1905, she writes, G speaks of nothing but his medicine. He has sold his gold watch to pay the pharmacist. The children are frightened of his moods when he lacks his dose. The family's financial records show their comfortable middle-class existence destroyed by medical expenses, and George's inability to work. The end of legal heroin didn't end these personal tragedies. Many addicts, cut off from legal supplies, turned to illegal sources or suffered through brutal withdrawal. Some succeeded in breaking free, but others remained dependent for life. The last generation of medical heroin addicts didn't die out until the 1960s and 1970s, carrying their Victorian-era affliction into the modern world. Nursing home records from the 1950s and 1960s occasionally note elderly residents with old morphine habits, euphemistic references to heroin addiction, dating back to the turn of the century. These individuals, respectable grandparents who had become addicted to cough medicine in their youth, lived their entire lives managing a dependency created by Victorian medicine. Today, heroin is synonymous with street drugs and addiction, so thoroughly transformed from its medical origins that many people don't know it was ever a legal medicine. The word itself has become one of the most charged in our language, evoking images of degradation and despair. That this same word once appeared on children's cough medicine seems almost unbelievable. Museums of medical history now display heroin bottles and advertisements as curiosities, artifacts of a more naive age. Visitors often laugh at the absurdity of giving heroin to babies, but this laughter misses the tragedy of the story. The Victorians weren't stupid or careless. They were people facing enormous suffering who trusted in scientific progress and medical authority. That this trust was betrayed makes their story not amusing, but heartbreaking. Yet the story isn't entirely one of failure and tragedy. The heroin crisis led to crucial advances in understanding addiction as a medical condition, rather than a moral failing. It spurred development of better pain management techniques and non-addictive cough suppressants. Most importantly, it taught hard lessons about the need for long-term safety studies, post-market surveillance, and skepticism of marketing claims. The development of modern addiction medicine can be traced directly to the heroin crisis. Doctors like Alexander Lambert and Charles Townes, working with heroin addicts, developed the first scientific approaches to addiction treatment. Their work, primitive by modern standards, established principles that still guide treatment today. The recognition of physical dependence, the importance of medical supervision during withdrawal, and the need for psychological support during recovery. Modern medicine still uses opioids, including drugs very similar to heroin, but with far greater understanding of their risks and benefits. The regulatory systems created in response to the heroin crisis, while imperfect, have prevented many potential pharmaceutical disasters. The requirement for clinical trials, the monitoring of adverse effects, the restrictions on marketing claims, all these safeguards exist because of lessons learned from heroin and similar disasters. The scientific advances prompted by the heroin crisis extended beyond addiction medicine. Researchers studying why some patients became addicted while others didn't pioneered the field of pharmacogenetics, understanding how genetic differences affect drug response. The concept of receptor binding, fundamental to modern pharmacology, was developed partly through studying how heroin affected the brain. Even the tragedy had its scientific silver linings. The Victorian heroin epidemic also demonstrates the importance of historical memory in public health. Each generation seems to need to relearn the dangers of addictive substances. The marketing playbook used by Bayer in 1898, emphasizing safety, minimizing addiction risk, targeting respectable users, has been recycled repeatedly. Understanding this history might help us recognize similar patterns before they cause similar disasters. Public health education changed dramatically in response to the heroin crisis. Before, drug information was primarily commercial, advertisements and promotional materials from pharmaceutical companies. After, governments recognized the need for independent drug information. The first public health campaigns about drug dangers, the predecessors of modern drug education programs, emerged from the heroin epidemic's aftermath. As we grapple with our current opioid crisis, the Victorian experience offers both warnings and hope. It warns us that addiction can emerge from the best intentions, that medical progress can become medical disaster, and that commercial interests can corrupt scientific judgment. But it also shows that societies can recognize their errors, implement reforms, and learn from tragedy. The response to the modern opioid crisis has been faster and more comprehensive than the response to Victorian heroin, partly because we have that historical example. Prescription monitoring programs, abuse deterrent formulations, and expanded addiction treatment all represent lessons learned from past failures. We're still making mistakes, but perhaps not quite the same mistakes. The Victorians who treated coughs with heroin weren't fools or villains. They were people facing enormous suffering with the best tools their science could provide. That those tools turned out to cause more suffering than they alleviated is a tragedy that echoes through history. Every bottle of Glyco-Heroin sold, every prescription written, every advertisement placed, represented both the heights of human ingenuity and the depths of unintended consequences. Walking through an old pharmacy museum, looking at the ornate heroin bottles with their promises of relief and cure, one can't help but wonder what current medical practices future generations will view with similar horror. What medicines in our cabinets today will seem as misguided as Victorian heroin? What suffering are we causing in our attempts to heal? These questions, uncomfortable as they are, represent perhaps the most important legacy of the heroin story. In the end, the story of Victorian heroin cough treatment is a profoundly human one. It's about our endless creativity in fighting suffering, our vulnerability to unintended consequences, and our capacity to learn from disaster. It reminds us that today's medical miracle might be tomorrow's cautionary tale, and that humility in the face of scientific progress isn't weakness, but wisdom. The Victorians treated coughs with heroin because they believed they were living in an age of medical miracles. We now know better, but only because they paid such a terrible price for that knowledge. Their suffering wasn't in vain if we remember its lessons and apply them to our own medical choices, our own miraculous age, and our own dangerous certainties.